Honorable guests, colleagues and friends, let me first start out by apologizing for not being there in person for this event and sharing my thoughts via this recording. I didn't want to miss this unique opportunity to be part of this pivotal conference organized by PICG at this perfect juncture when we need to reinforce the importance of governance as a society. It's both a privilege and I believe a responsibility to speak on an issue of immense importance for Pakistan's economic future and something very close to my heart, the corporate governance challenges in state-owned enterprises or SOEs as we call them commonly. SOEs are critical to Pakistan's economy, operating in strategic sectors such as energy, transport, communication and finance, essentially as utilities. Their contributions extend, or may be better to say supposed to extend, beyond merely delivering on the bottom line. They play a fundamental role in generating employment, legitimately of course, building infrastructure and supporting long-term growth. Yet, despite this critical role, many SOEs have sadly become synonymous with inefficiency, financial mismanagement and an unhealthy dependence on government bailouts. Interestingly enough, a phenomena not just confined to Pakistan alone, but virtually across the globe in SOEs, 80s UK case in point. A particularly telling statistic about Pakistan is the cumulative losses of SOEs, which now overtly exceed 1 trillion rupees annually, which has a massive potential for covering these losses, but also substantially contributing to the exchequer. This pattern of persistent financial hemorrhaging is a stark indication of a systemic crisis within our SOEs, the root cause of which lies in governance failure. Financial firefighting, while necessary in short term, cannot resolve the underlying governance issues, which is an unfortunate dilemma of our country as a whole and is topic of discussion for another sitting perhaps. Governance structures in many SOEs are vulnerable to political interference, giving conflicting interest between the dominant sponsor and the other stakeholders, including minority shareholders and employees, where appointment to key leadership positions are exposed to the risk of political loyalty rather than competence or merit. One of the most classic governance challenges in most of the SOEs is lack or blurred distinction between the government's role as owner and its role as a regulator. When both functions are concentrated in one entity like FBR, until recently CAA, and to some extent in E&P sector, which I am representing today, creates a conflict of interest of the sorts, which not only severely undermines independent and effective oversight, but more so creates far-reaching structural inefficiencies and challenges which results in market failures, monopoly-like situations, and lack of competition, fair and level playing field. The energy sector provides the clearest example of how poor governance has real-world consequences. The circular debt crisis, which crosses 4 trillion rupees, is the direct result of operational inefficiencies, financial mismanagement, and a flawed regulatory framework. Despite repeated tariff hikes, some as high as 50%, the sector remains deeply unprofitable. These tariff increases do nothing to address the fundamental problems of governance. They merely transfer the financial burden to consumers, further straining the economy, which failing to resolve the underlying inefficiencies and governance gaps. The energy sector struggles are emblematic of the broader challenges being faced by SOEs. The sector demonstrates the critical need for reform, particularly in terms of privatizing distribution companies or DISCOs, which continue to be a significant drain on public finances. However, it is crucial to recognize that privatization on its own is not a panacea and shall not be driven by a pigeon approach, as I call it, hoping that the confronted problem will disappear by closing the eyes only. Let's not throw the baby with the bathwater. Privatization without strengthening regulatory frameworks is a recipe for disaster and possibly end up creating a monopoly under private sector instead of public, which may be more harmful than help in the medium to long term by losing the eye on the ball on the very objective of a utility. Another word of caution for an unplanned privatization is to set the structure of privatization and criteria for selection of successful private party right. A private entity to be picked up must be a long-term player with patience capital and a wider societal impact and perspective, and not just the sole focus on profitability, and that also in the short run. If the right partner is not selected from the private sector, and for instance, opt for someone like a private equity fund for a utility, then the situation will end up either spoiling the privatized entity or letting the private equity fund go out of business. A glaring example of that is in front of our eyes in one of the privatized entities in energy power sector. A larger lesson for energy sector's crisis is clear. Without proper governance structure, SOEs, or for that matter private enterprises, will continue to be a burden on the national economy, regardless of how much capital or resources are injected. Recognizing the need for reforms, the introduction of SOE law is a significant step in improving SOE governance. All these, nevertheless, are a transitory arrangements to my mind. We eventually have to move towards privatization, or in other words, private-public partnership structures. Our sole focus to ensure better governance shall rest squarely in competent and independent regulators. Only an independent and empowered regulator would regiment that the board and the management are fit and proper, which is the first step to achieve better corporate governance, and would continue towards best interest of the various stakeholders in a holistic fashion. I must like to quote and recognize the role of State Bank of Pakistan in this context. Corporate governance reforms will also have a far-reaching impact on the integration of environmental, social and governance principles. Around the world, ESG is emerging as a key benchmark for sustainability, and Pakistan's corporate sector, particularly SOEs, must align themselves with these global standards. Governance reforms cannot exist in isolation. They must be supported by comprehensive efforts to address the political economy. Rent-seeking subsidies that disproportionately benefit certain industries must be eliminated. Instead, subsidies should be targeted towards the poorest and the most vulnerable segments of the society. Additionally, performance-based subsidies tied to measurable economic outcomes such as export growth, tax revenue generation and job creation can serve as a powerful incentive for driving efficiency in corporate sector. Corporate governance reforms are not just a theoretical exercise. They are an urgent and practical necessity for achieving operational excellence and are directly linked with financial rewards eventually. If not in the immediate future, then surely in the medium to long term. A fact needs to be sunk in with the corporate sector. If left unchecked, these issues will continue to drain public resources, stifle economic growth, and undermine consumer interest. In conclusion, while the challenges we face are enormous, the path forward is clear. Governance reforms must lie at the heart of any strategy to vitalize Pakistan's economy in general and SOEs in particular. This will require political will, courageous leadership, and a commitment to dismantling entrenched system of patronage and inefficiency. Striving for better productivity will remain key and center of all our decision making. Pakistan's economic future depends on our ability as individuals to get this right. I must stress that while rules and regulation vis-a-vis corporate governance can take us that far, but it's the individual act which ensures transparency and meritocracy, especially in an environment of fragile governance structures, which is typically the case in public sector. It is incumbent upon the executives in public sector, therefore, to act at the highest level of ethics and integrity, more so than any other setup perhaps. given the inherent governance challenges. Let us all work towards doing the right things and being better human beings in our individual capacities. This may sound like a cliche or an ideal thing to say, but trust me, it's the crux of how a better society emerges, which at the end of the day drives governance, albeit in the private sector, SOEs, or otherwise. Together we can build a stronger, more efficient, and more competitive Pakistan, and it begins with fixing governance in our daily lives, let alone in SOEs. Thank you very much.